Thanks, Jason, and just keep an eye on the open mics because I think as people come in, it's defaulting to people being open. Anyway, Tim, alcoholic, and also Al-Anon. I'm going to talk about the Al-Anon step 1. And also what I say is going to apply to any other addiction. I think my experience is the principles are the same, whatever the addiction. Needs a little bit of adaptation. Just a tiny bit of background. So my last drink was in July 1993. My drinking goes back to the mid 1980s, and my Al-Anonism goes back even further. I'm very active in AA and Al-Anon. I don't do any other fellowships right now. I found that AA and Al-Anon, the combination of the two, has satisfactorily solved problems in all sorts of other areas for which there are 12-step fellowships. Sometimes people need to go to multiple fellowships. I've found it unnecessary. That's not good or bad. It's just a fact. So why is step 1 even necessary? Well, step 1 is necessary because the program is necessary. Why is the program necessary? And it's a circular question because step 1 actually provides the answer, but I think something can be discussed before we even get to that. My addiction is such that my alcoholism is such that I become suicidal as a result, as a direct result of the substances, the behaviors. And that's true of my drinking. It's true of my use of other substances. It's true of my relationship with alcoholics. I can become so entangled with an alcoholic that that the only way out I can see is to either push them down the stairs or kill myself. Certainly, so-called love addiction, I don't think it is love addiction. I think it's something else. We'll come to that later. And sex addiction can equally, talks in the doctor's opinion, that some people choose to make the supreme sacrifice rather than continuing to fight. And that's what it's talking about. It's talking about suicide. However, and I speak from experience, however suicidal I felt, it's a very difficult thing to actually do. The mechanics are not straightforward. There's something deep within me that simply won't let me, or simply historically has not let me. And I was talking to someone earlier this morning about unmanageability. And in the fellowship of AA in general, you hear on the question of unmanageability, dozens of different interpretations. Some people look at the bedevilments in the big book on page 52. I actually have a big book, just a moment. So people say, we were having trouble with personal relationships. We couldn't control our emotional natures. We were a prey to misery and depression. We couldn't make a living. We had a feeling of uselessness. We were full of fear. We were unhappy. We couldn't seem to be a real help to other people. Now, those were true of me when I got to AA, but they've been true for years. And they certainly didn't dent my alcoholism. I just took them into account as, well, that's the reality I'm living. They're not the reason for the crisis. A crisis, I'm told by my Greek scholar friends, of whom I have none, that crisis is a turning point in the disease. You get to a point and there's a crisis, like with a fever, that either the person is going to recover or the fever will kill. And as with any other condition, I think that alcoholism has a crisis point, and the crisis point is not this accumulation of negative circumstances. I have a very high tolerance for suffering. It's not infinite, but it's very high. If it hadn't been, I couldn't have drunk for years. So there's something else. There's something else which brings about the turning point. And this inability to die, even though I wanted to, is one aspect of it. But there's another one, and it's in the 12 and 12, where it's talking about unmanageability. So in AA's early days, only people who are very serious alcoholics and very far advanced were even considered for AA. There are a couple of exceptions. But generally, it was people who are very far gone. And by the 1950s, all sorts of other people were tipping up at AA who still had their jobs and still had their houses and still had their these and still had their those. So what does unmanageability mean for them? And it says, how could they admit their lives are unmanageable? And it says, it was obviously necessary to raise the bottom the rest of us had hit to the point where it hit them. Now, people talk about this raising the bottom, saying, well, I know you haven't had complete catastrophes, but let's look at the small catastrophes. Let's pretend they're bad enough, and then you can have just as much of a rock bottom as the rest of us. And that's good as far as it goes, but what the program is going to require is an absolute surrender. And I don't think one can absolutely surrender on the basis of having a few bad days. There's something more. It's the argument in the 12 and 12 is not that, oh, well, it's only a little bit bad, but that'll have to be good enough. What it talks about is, no, it is as bad for you as it is for the rest of us, but you just can't see it yet. And what it says is this: by going back in our own drinking histories, we could show that years before we realized it, we were out of control, that our drinking even then was no mere habit, that it was indeed the beginning of a fatal progression. And I'm going to contrast 3 medical conditions. The first one is a skin condition called impetigo, which is relatively rare. You don't hear people talking about it. I had it once. It's very unpleasant visually. It's a sort of scabby skin thing. Now, a friend of mine had it. He didn't realize he had it. He knew he had something, but he was one of these people that doesn't like doctors, or didn't like doctors. So he sort of put up with it for a long time. And it was this scab on his face, and it would grow, and then it would get smaller, then it would grow again, and he became very self-conscious and didn't want to go out and hated going to work, and it started to warp his personality. But, well, I'm stuck with this thing for the rest of his life. And he went to a Chinese doctor in the end, who gave him some mud to put on it, and that didn't work. And he went to all sorts of other practitioners. Eventually, after a year, he went to the doctor. Doctor gave him a pill, it fell off. And within 4 or 5 days, his skin was back to normal. That's what you do if you've got impetigo. But the point about impetigo, it's not a deadly disease. It's not even a very serious disease. It's just visually unsightly. It grabs your attention visually. And some people do terrible things when they're drinking, and there are lots of very external signs that there is something going on. So they look physically ill. They might lose a job. It could be all sorts of things going on, but it's external. They don't care. They're enjoying their drinking. And when it becomes too much, they just stop. Rather like this gentleman with impetigo. So I don't think the rock bottom is anything to do with external circumstances being difficult or unsightly or anything. Now, another type of medical condition is the stubbed toe. I don't know about you, when I stubbed my toe, I scream blue murder. And every single time I think I've broken my toe, to my knowledge, I never have. I've never got it x-rayed. I've never felt the need to get it x-rayed. But the very acute suffering passes very quickly. So, and it's not the basis for a long-term change in life. It's not the basis for a long-term change in one's approach to life, the course of one's actions. So I don't think a rock bottom is acute pain. Now, sometimes people cite an array of external circumstances as the rock bottom. Sometimes people cite acute pain as the rock bottom. Now, these might get your attention, but they're not enough to form the basis for living an entirely different life for the rest of your natural life. If you're going to live an entirely different life for the rest of your natural life, you have to have something more than just a few external circumstances which are disagreeable, and something a little more than an emotional stubbed toe, because the pain will fade. You can remember it theoretically, but not emotionally. Now let's look at a third condition, where you have no external symptoms, you don't feel bad, but some routine test shows that there is a growth somewhere. And you're told very clearly, if this continues to grow, it's going to take over your whole body and will kill you in 1 to 2 years. Nothing has happened externally. You don't even feel bad, but boy, would you do something about that. You'd want it cut out of you and zapped out of you. You'd do anything to have it gotten rid of. And that is alcoholism. It's being trapped in something which is going to kill you. That is the rock bottom. If you may or may not have suffered emotionally very badly. You may or may not have an array of unpleasant circumstances, but those are trivial artifacts. That they're not the thing itself. The thing itself is being trapped. And I'll give you a good example of what being trapped is like. Imagine you're motoring along the motorway, the highway, freeway, and you're going along at 70 miles an hour. It's a sunny day. It's a straight road. There is no other traffic. Everything is absolutely fine. You're listening to your favorite station. And you just touch the steering wheel slightly to just adjust the course. And you realize the steering wheel is locked. And you try harder and it's just locked. There's nothing you can do about it. Then you think, well, that's all right. What I'll do is I'll slow down. So you tap the brake very slightly to start to slow down, and the pedal goes all the way down, but nothing happens. And you realize that the car it can't be braked. And you think, well, I'll brake by going down gears. You press down the clutch and you move down to a lower gear, but it's clear that the gear stick is just waggling inside the mechanism. It's not doing anything. And you think, I can't go down the gears. Then you think, well, there's the handbrake. And you go to start to just pull the handbrake very slightly to see if you can slow the car down. It comes all the way up, nothing happens. And right now, nothing bad has happened. You're driving along perfectly safely along a very, very straight road. There is no traffic, but at some point you're going to die. When there is a bend in the road, when there is traffic in the way, you're going to die. Nothing will stop you. This is the end of it. Another image which came to me many years ago was, imagine you're in a comedy show. It's in the dark and there's a chap on the stage and he's very funny and you're having a lovely time. You thought, well, I'm going to go and buy myself some popcorn, some Maltesers. And you go to the end of the road to walk up the aisle to the lobby at the front. And when you get to the end of the row, out of the darkness, you realize there is a man with a machine gun. who's pointing you back towards the seat. And you go back to the seat because you have no choice. You're now trapped there. The show will no longer be funny, yet nothing has changed. So the rock bottom, which prompts a person to do the step, certainly me, was the realization I was trapped inside a fatal pattern, which, if not arrested somehow, would kill me. And this realization came through understanding three features of alcoholism. I'm doing the prognosis first. In any medical condition, and alcoholism is one in a sense, you've got diagnosis. How do you know you've got it? You've got prognosis. What's going to happen if it's not treated? And then you've got treatment. Diagnosis, prognosis, treatment. We're looking at prognosis right now. What are the three characteristics of the prognosis? Number one, it's progressive. And I remember when I was a kid having little miniatures of various liqueurs and this and that and Campari and whatever. And a few little miniatures were all that it took to jolly me up and send me off to the races. I remember my last Christmas drunk. I had the best part of a bottle of gin. I had the best part of a bottle of Cointreau. I had some other things, and it didn't even touch the sides. I haven't even started to get any sense of relief, progression. When I was young, very young, I was able to not drink on occasions where it would cause the most almighty kerfuffle if I did. At the end of my drinking, I couldn't keep a lid on it, even when it would be in my best immediate interests to do so, where it would cause all sorts of ructions and conflict with the people immediately around me were I to drink. I couldn't keep a lid on it. So there was very, very clearly a progression between the beginning and the end of my drinking. So if you've got something progressive, it's going to carry on progressing. That's the nature of a condition which is progressive. Fatal. I would get myself into scrapes on a regular basis, which potentially could be fatal. But the fatality is also a function of the progressive nature. I was getting increasingly ill physically, and I wasn't stupid. I knew it was the drink. You know when you got a hangover. I mean, you'd have to be pretty dim not to realize the reason you got the most stonking headache on a Monday morning is everything you drank on a Sunday evening. I mean, everyone can see the connection. I was in a very bad physical state. So it's very clear where it was going, and how alcoholics die is a matter of public record. The tricky thing as well about the fatality of alcoholism is that it's not linear. It picks people off at surprising points of time. Some people survive for surprisingly long. Some people are picked off surprisingly early. One comes across people, I know people who died in their early 20s in various ways. So it is progressive, it is fatal, it is also incurable. Now, the incurability is very hard to prove. One can do it through one's own experience. I remember in 1991, I reformed myself over the summer. I stopped drinking, and I got a job, which was a great surprise to everyone. Now, I didn't perform this job in the conventional manner. I had what we refer to as sticky fingers, and the little sticky fingers would go into the till and money would stick to them and then go into my pocket. So I didn't work in a I did work, but I also had my own little sideline going on. But I was sober. I think I drank maybe on one or two occasions that summer. Nothing really happened. I thought, well, I'm all right now. But this period of sobriety for several months, it did not, first of all, it didn't last. Secondly, when I resumed drinking, I was back where I was before. The period of sobriety had not changed the nature of my drinking. So this condition is incurable. Once you've got it, you've got it. And if you're unsure about this, all you need to do is go to AA for a few weeks and listen out for people talking about stories of having gone out and gone out after many years of sobriety and discovering that things are the same or worse than they had been before. Of course, one occasionally does come across people who left AA and drink normally, but my experience in the people I've known well is those cases are vanishingly rare and invariably resolve in the direction of catastrophe. But it can take a while. So if people have been sober a long time, sometimes it takes years from when they resume drinking before they're in real trouble. But one by one, they either die or come back. So progressive, fatal, and incurable. So this is a very serious question. Once you realize how serious a question it is, how serious it is to be an alcoholic, and the only treatment, we'll come to that later on. Once you realize how serious it is, the only remaining question is, have I got it? And this, I think, is a very straightforward question. Am I an alcoholic? But I think it's made a meal of in AA. I'm going to say a few things which are opinions, which are not official AA doctrine, but there we go. A 12-step call, and I've done a number of 12-step calls. I've had a number of 12-step conversations with people over the years. In other words, I'm in a position where there is someone who's never been to AA or hasn't been to AA in many years or has had minimal exposure or is still trying to figure out, am I like these people? And you listen to their story and you match their story with elements of your own in the hope that they'll identify in a general way, oh, I seem to be in the same basket of humanity as these people. I seem to be the same sort of person. And this is all well and good, but it is quite a different question than the diagnosis of alcoholism. The diagnosis of alcoholism is the same diagnosis, whoever you are, whatever your history, whatever your age. All of those biographical details are there for a different purpose. They're not there for the diagnosis of alcoholism. So in the back of the big book, there are 42 stories. And the reason the book itself says there are 42 stories is because we're hoping that readers will identify with one of them. It doesn't say we hope you identify with all 42. It says we hope you identify with one. Why does it say that? Because it knows that the chances that you will identify with any particular story are remote, because people's stories differ hugely. But if you hear enough stories, something will get through the defenses and you'll connect and you'll think, oh, maybe I am. And then over time, you learn how to identify with more and more people. But this is the identification and the storytelling is the sales pitch to get people in through the door and to get them to stay long enough to actually do the diagnostic work. Now, that's all well and good, and that's absolutely right. It's the only, with people who aren't yet sold on AA, you can't go in with all the stuff that I'm talking about today because it won't make any sense. You've got to go, and the purpose of this is not to encourage someone to join AA or to join a 12-step fellowship. I'm presuming that everyone here has got that, it's not your first meeting. If it is your first meeting, then grab some numbers afterwards and get people to take you to actual meetings, because this is not an ordinary meeting. It's very specifically on the 12 steps. So you've accidentally walked into the wrong class, in a sense. You've met the right people, but in the wrong class. So grab some people. Anyway, I was at a conference a while ago where it was a perfectly good conference, perfectly standard AA conference where lots of different people spoke. And a good 50 to 70% of each talk was essentially storytelling about the period before joining AA or the very early days. Lots of details, caricatured, no points being made, just storytelling. Now, I don't know who that was for. There were no non-AA members there that we were trying to encourage to join AA. There weren't even any newcomers. The sales pitch was being directed at people who'd paid a lot of money to travel a long way to come and listen to the sales pitch for joining AA in the first place. And I don't know what purpose it serves. I haven't for a long time. I know I'm in a minority. A lot of people like the stories. I can take them or leave them, frankly, unless the person is a gifted storyteller. I'm afraid I wade through the story, waiting to get to the good stuff, which is where people start to make insightful points about how they work the program. That becomes interesting. So the diagnosis, if you try to diagnose yourself as an alcoholic by asking to what extent do I identify in general with people's stories, you won't come up with any conclusive answer, because for every person you identify with, there'll be someone you don't. And you have people saying the most extraordinary thing. They say, well, I don't identify with the drinking that people talk about, but I identify with the ism. There is no ism. Alcoholism is about drinking. It's not about anything else. That's why it's called alcoholism. Page 44 of the big book. If when you honestly want to, you find you cannot quit entirely, quit drinking. And if when you drink, you cannot control the amount you take, the amount of alcohol, you're probably alcoholic. So alcoholism is about drinking. It's not about anything else. Now, people might start squeaking at this point and saying, yes, but what about the spiritual malady? Now, that's going to get discussed later on in step 4, actually. That's the chief place it's discussed. The solution, I'll come back to diagnosis in a minute, but I want to make this point very, very clear. I'm not denying that we have a spiritual malady. We do. But remember those bedevilments we read out earlier? Those are not, the book does not say these are features of alcoholism. It describes these as human problems. Don't know if you've read a newspaper or watched a television program recently, but those bedevilments are universal. Very hard to find people that don't identify with one or more of them. Completely universal. The spiritual malady, the world and its people were often quite wrong. On page 66, not alcoholics were often quite wrong. Self-will run riot is not a feature of alcoholism. Its examples include an alcoholic, but also include the outlaw safecracker, the politicians and the reformers. We live in an age of reformers. Politicians and reformers who think it would all be utopia if everyone agreed with them. The retired businessman lolling in the Florida sunshine. These are not alcoholics. Self-will run riot is not a feature of alcoholism. It is a feature of humanity. The history of religion is, if you read the Old Testament, self will run riot. Abraham disappears. What do? You build a golden calf and start bowing down to it. And then daddy comes back and everyone is upset. The history of humanity is the history of self-will run riot. Why it's relevant to alcoholism is this. Left to my own devices, I'm compelled to drink. When I drink, I'm compelled to carry on. I can't do anything about the second part. I can't do anything about the fact I'm compelled to carry on. The only solution is to avoid the first drink. However, my mind will tell me that a drink is a good idea. Therefore, I must not have as my highest authority my own mind, because my own mind is irreparably broken in that particular regard. It may be intact with everything else. I may be able to speak a foreign language or fry an egg, but when it comes to alcohol, I'm not well wrapped. Most of the time, I can see that it's a bad idea. There are moments when it's simply surrounded by this pleasant glow and it looks like a good idea. I must not be in charge. If I'm not in charge, someone has to be. Someone has to drive the bus. So I must be second in command, not first in command, under the direction of a higher power. And this is where the spiritual malady comes in. What is the spiritual malady? Is the condition that arises from setting myself up as the highest authority in my own life. So it's that which stands in the way of putting God in charge. If I want to be in charge, I'm not going to put God in charge. I have to somehow step down from being the captain of knowing all things to being just a humble servant. The spiritual malady, self-will run riot, selfishness, self-centeredness, all of those things, they're not part of the problem. They're what is standing in the way of the solution. So if you've got a broken arm and you need to go to the hospital, and there is an impediment on the road in between you and the hospital, the impediment needs to be gotten rid of to get to the hospital. Let's say there's been a car crash, there's a pile-up, and you have to go round it to get to the hospital. You wouldn't say that the pile-up is part of your broken arm. It's got nothing to do with your broken, but it is what gets in the way of getting you to the hospital to get the treatment that you need. And that's the status of all the spiritual stuff, what people incorrectly call the ism, all of the emotional problems, all of the psychological difficulties, all of the grievances, the fears, the guilt, the shames, the jealousies, the envies. Those are manifestations of self, of self-will, of self-centeredness, of self-obsession, of ego. They are what in the way of, they are what are in the way of God. But I need God, so they have to go, which is why all of that stuff gets discussed, not in step 1, but in step 3, and then in step 4. But we'll come to that when we get to steps 3 and 4. You see, you can have alcoholics that are reasonably well-balanced emotion. And you can have people outside AA that have all of those so-called isms, but are not alcoholics. Alcoholism is deadly enough as it is, without construing it to be all sorts of things that it's not. People say, I was an alcoholic before I ever had a drink. Now, one might have had the capacity to become one, but one isn't one until one is compelled to drink. If you're not compelled to drink and you've never drunk, you cannot, by definition, be an alcoholic. Might be a potential one. The diagnosis. 2 features. That's all. Feature number 1. When I drink too much, repeatedly. Now, immediately, this is an interesting question. Well, how much is too much? Is it 8 units? Is it 14 units? How many bottles? Give me an amount. It's not. It's carefully worded that. Too much means too much for me. There are lots of people in AA who drank less than people on the outside world who are drinking far more and are not experiencing any particular problems. And when they want to turn off the tap, they can turn off the tap. It's not about the quantity. Now, I can't tell whether I drank too much by asking myself, did I take each drink on purpose? For me to drink, my mind has to give me the command, go and drink the drink. It might be automatic or semi-automatic, but it has to go through my mind for me to go and have the drink. So that's why every drink felt like it was a jolly good idea at the time. I'm not sure I ever thought, oh, I shouldn't be drinking this. I don't think I ever thought that, especially once I'd had the first drink. Maybe there was a few qualms before the first drink, but certainly after the first drink, glug, glug, glug. That was all. I want it. I want it. I'm going to do it. I want it. I'm going to do it. I want it. I'm going to do it. So whether one wanted to is no evidence of anything. But there are some curious features of this. How do you know it's too much? Did you wake up the next morning regretting what you drank, how much you drank, and what you did? Did you ever drink more than you intended? It's with reference to the before and the after that you can tell whether you overshot, not by how it felt at the time. The physical craving is a very curious thing as well. So that's a technical term. Now, craving in the language in general means your desire before the first thing. So, you know, Sally's in the office, she craves chocolate, so she goes and buys chocolate. Now, that's a craving to have the first bar of chocolate or the first bite of chocolate. We're not talking about that. The term craving in the big book means what is triggered by having the first drink. And it can be likened to a mosquito bite. If you've ever had a mosquito bite and you make the mistake of scratching it, it makes the mosquito bite itchier. Scratching the itch doesn't satisfy the itch, it amplifies the itch and makes it worse. And then you wish you hadn't scratched it in the first place. And this is the feature of compulsive drinking, that when you satisfy it, it doesn't say, oh, thank you very much, I'm off now. It says, no, give me more, give me more, give me more. It becomes more intense, not less. Why do we say that this is a physical phenomenon? So why is it a physical craving? Well, people say, well, I used to throw up a lot, so that's how I know it's a physical craving. That's obviously not it. Anyone that drinks too much is going to throw up. That's just natural physiology. And it's also not necessarily perceived physically. Sometimes people talk about it being perceived physically. What they're usually talking about is very, very strong emotions. I think what it means is that something I do is either the result of a rational process or it is an automatic process. And I don't know about you, when I'd had 1.5 bottles of wine, I didn't think through whether or not to have the next glass by mentally totting up the pros and the cons and then deciding in favor of the next glass. It was automatic. There was no reasoning process. And non-alcoholics they reason. They work out whether they're going to have another one. You see them making the decision. I saw Jonathan yesterday making the pour alcohol back into the bottle. I've never seen the like. He made a decision there. Oh, I lost you, everyone. Oh, good, you're back. Okay. So if it's not a rational decision, it's automatic. So it's coming from something beyond the conscious mind. The only thing it can come from, therefore, is the body and the physical brain doing something. So how do you know you've got it? If you repeatedly overshoot and do things you shouldn't do, there are only 3 options. You're either psychotic or you're stupid or you're powerless. That's it. I can't think of any other options. If that's the case, if one has done that for years, the question is about the first drink. Did you go through a rational process? Well, a rational process would tell you, if you have the physical craving when you drink, a rational process would tell you that you shouldn't drink at all. It's the fact of resuming drinking. It's not the thought process that precedes it, because the thought process it differs from person to person. Some people are preoccupied with drink for months before they relapse. Other people, it comes completely out of the blue. There is no common pattern of what precedes a relapse into alcoholic drinking. The only thing all of those situations have in common is that the person resumes, even though it's a catastrophic idea and everyone else is horrified, and yet one does it anyway. And those are the 2 features. The mental obsession is not preoccupation with alcohol. Again, the terminology is unhelpful, but we're stuck with it because it's what's in the book. It's the persistently recurring, overriding idea that a drink is a good idea when it's not. Hence, it's a delusion. And if you imagine your frontal lobes, the front bit of the brain, which is responsible for decision making, I'm told, there are all sorts of other bits of the brain which shoot up suggestions and ideas to the front part for consideration. This is what happens in a healthy person. And the person then weighs up the pros and cons and makes a decision. The point about alcoholism is the bit of the brain which periodically shoots up the command, let's go and get drunk. It's as though it's got a VIP label attached to it. In other words, the thought bypasses any real rational decision-making process and automatically activates an action, automatically converts into an action, namely, have another drink. Screens are frozen, so I'm going to wait a moment till it comes back. There we go. You seem to be back again. So we've got and I have a body which compels me to continue the whole thing, is never again to be in charge, never again to be in charge, always to be second in command. It doesn't mean that I just wait for life to happen. I still have to be the one that takes all of the actions. People talk about you have to get out of the driving seat. I don't think that's correct. A life doesn't run itself. I need to take actions. The question is which actions? The question is not whether I'm active, it's what is directing the actions. Is it my emotions, or is it the combination that AA suggests of the 12-step program, the principles, the people, and prayer? And those four things activate the power. And we can talk about that more in step 2. On the Al-Anon front, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives have become unmanageable. Now, AA's got a nice sort of foundation text, which is reasonably coherent, written mostly by one person. So you've got a clean story. In Al-Anon, there are lots of different books written by all sorts of different people. So most of the books past the early days of Al-Anon were written by suggesting lots of people send in suggested passages, and then they collated them like jigsaw puzzles. So there is no coherent picture in the Al-Anon literature, which is unhelpful, but there we go. That's the situation we're dealing with. I'll tell you my construal of step 1 in Al-Anon. First of all, what I always do with Al-Anon sponsees is get them to understand alcoholism as I've presented it above. So let's say your alcoholic is called Bobby. You recognize that Bobby is powerless over whether he has the first drink. He's powerless over what he drinks thereafter. He's powerless, therefore, over what he does. And as a result, he's not in charge of his life. That's what unmanageability means. It means you're not in charge of your life. Your alcoholism is in charge of you. You may or may not be neurotic. You may or may not be disorganized. You may or may not be incompetent, but what you are is not in control. So once you understand that Bobby's drinking is out of control, you say, well, what about your attempts? Are you able to keep Bobby from having a drink? No. Are you able to control how much Bobby drinks? No. Are you able to control what Bobby does when he's drunk? No. And I had long experience of alcoholics, particularly in my early 20s, drinking alcoholics. There have been a few since then. where I am as powerless over whether or not they drink as they are. And if they are in my life, there is an unpredictable factor in my life that I cannot control. And to the extent that there are drinking alcoholics in my life, to that precise extent is my life unmanageable as a direct result of their presence. Whatever you plan becomes uncertain when there is an alcoholic involved, because they are not in charge of their schedule. They're not in charge of their thought life, but in particular, they're not in charge of their schedule. They can say, I'm going to show up. They're going to say, we can leave for this destination at this time. If they're not ready, they're not ready. And they're not choosing to do that. There is something else pulling the strings. So if I've got someone in my life who is under the malign influence of active alcoholism, to that precise extent is my life unmanageable. But it's worse. If for those of you who are Al-Anons, you probably had the experience like this, that I've had this experience many times. You have an alcoholic in your life, drinking or sober or somewhere in between. And you suddenly realize it. Monday is fine, you don't think about them at all. Tuesday is fine, you don't think about them. Wednesday is fine, you don't think about them. Thursday, you realize they haven't been in touch for a few days, and now you immediately become preoccupied. Are they drinking? Are they going to meetings? Are they all right? Shall I contact their sister? Shall I contact their brother? Shall I send them an email? Shall I send them a voicemail? Shall I call? Would that be intrusive if I start? And then all you think about is them. Now, that's one of 1,000 examples. But the powerlessness here is not only is Bobby powerless over his alcoholism, not only am I powerless over Bobby's alcoholism, but I'm powerless over my own reaction to the alcoholic, which is irrational, unhelpful, and makes me unhappy. And I'm now not in charge of my life. I discover myself driving across London late at night to go and minister to someone who's had some sort of relapse, because only you can help me. I had not planned when I got up that morning to be driving across London at 10 o'clock at night, yet there I am. Who's in charge of my day? I'm clearly not, because I didn't have the ability to say no. So powerlessness over my own reaction to the alcoholic mentally and practically means, again, you may or may not have chaos. Chaos is not a distinctive sign of powerlessness, and it's not a necessary sign of powerlessness. It can look a life which is unmanageable can look very orderly. It can look very systematic. But the question is, who or what is calling the shots? When you discover as an Al-Anon that the shots are being called by the state of the alcoholic, that is dictating the course of your day, your actions, your words, your thoughts, you're not in charge of your life. And then you discover yourself doing the same thing with the world. You treat the world, you treat the organization you work for, the class of children in front of you, you start to treat them as though they are an alcoholic and discover yourself just as string pulled by them as you are by the alcoholic. It's in charge of you, you're not in charge of it. And as a result, your life, which should be manageable by you, is not being managed by you. It's being managed by the thing which is pulling your strings. With the other compulsions, whether it's so-called love addiction, which is really romantic obsession, and sex addiction, which is much more clearly an ordinary addiction, frankly, there's almost nothing that need be said, because it's the same all the way through. The two elements of powerlessness and then the unmanageability. And the pattern is this: a persistent return to an unhealthy pattern. So if the pattern is unhealthy, it's doing you no good at all, whether it's indecorous sexual encounters or romantic obsessions with people that make you as unhappy as they ever made you happy, whether it's food, whatever it is, the pattern is unhealthy. That's not enough. There must be a persistent return to it. So even when, for whatever reason, through grace or circumstance or providence or anything, you're separated from it, do you go back to it? If you've got those two features, you've got powerlessness, and the unmanageability is simply the consequence of that. Powerlessness is my internal state. Unmanageability is the consequence in my life. And I'm going to finish the presentation on this. We've got time for a few questions, so feel free to start putting your hands up if you have any questions. I heard an Alcoholics Anonymous public information video many years ago where the voiceover said, this is Brian. Brian has lost control of his drinking and thus his life. If I'm not in charge of my drinking, I'm not in charge of my life. Very simple, very straightforward. Same as with diabetes. If I'm not in control of my insulin production, my blood sugar is unmanageable. One is the consequence of the other. They're not two entirely separate topics. And this approach not only has the virtue of being accurate, in my view, it also has the virtue of being consistent with the Big Book, which means you now have a common language with anyone else using the Big Book in whatever the fellowship is. But thirdly, this way of looking at things, it has the virtue of being usable by anyone who has an addiction, whatever the addiction, whatever stage it's reached. I found it very difficult for years when unmanageability was construed as basically being incompetent, neurotic, disorganized, trying to coach newcomers through step one who were doing better in their lives than most people I knew who were 10, 15, 20 years sober. How do you do that if you're construing unmanageability to be the devil? You just can't. Seeing unmanageability as it was intended, which is just a natural consequence of powerlessness, brings everyone into the fold, makes step one very easy, very simple, very easy to take other people through. John, your question.
Thanks, Tim. Why does the Big Book distinguish between the potential and the real alcoholic? And is that a helpful distinction?
Okay, so yeah, so that's a good question. There's a trick with the potential alcoholic. Okay, so if you can stop, then you don't need to. If you don't need to, you carry on. Now, there's some invisible line that gets crossed and that's the potential alcoholic. The potential alcoholic is someone who can stop, but because they can, they don't need to. They carry on drinking, and then they cross the line, and they become someone who can't stop, and therefore should and must stop. If you've got an alcoholic and a potential alcoholic, they're both going to carry on drinking, and the potential will convert into being a full-blown alcoholic. So if you're a potential alcoholic, actually you're on the same. It's like being pregnant, but the bump isn't showing. You're on the train is heading to the destination. It just may not be manifesting. I think that's what they mean by it. It doesn't mean that you don't have the features of it, not fully, but since that's the direction you're heading in, you're just as doomed. The destination on your ticket is the same as the destination on the ticket of the alcoholic who is florid, whose symptoms are fully showing. So the potential alcoholic, even if someone identifies himself as such, they're in exactly the same position as a real alcoholic. So there's no practical difference. Jason.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Yeah, my question is basically there's a lot of SA members here today. Yeah, there probably some people might be sort of a bit confused because that you've spoken about Al-Anon, AA. I just sort of wanted you to just, you've had experience with SA members, just sort of give us an understanding of what you think about the step one for an SA member. Also, another question is that there's a high relapse rate in SA. Do you see any way, like any solutions for that? Thanks.
So very good questions. Yeah, so my experience with the S stuff, my understanding of myself, and I'm fortunately in a position in my life where I'm not acting out in that area, and I haven't for a long time. It's as though I'm my own chemistry factory, that rather than having to take in a chemical to produce a particular effect in my mind, I'm able to do it through my behavior or even my thought. And what I look at, rather than drinking, is the list of thinking patterns or behavior patterns which bring about that sudden, it's like dropping through the floor into another world, where you're suddenly utterly preoccupied with basically with sex or some aspect of it, or looking for it, and it's exactly the same with romance. It's like suddenly discovering yourself in another world. And you take everything that's been said about alcohol and you apply it to those behavior patterns, whether it's porn, whether it's using apps, whether it's looking for sex in particular places, whether it's engaging in sex with particular types of people in particular situations. It's the idea that you can be fine for a long time. The thought occurs to you, it grips you, and you must obey. You have no choice. You can fight it temporarily, but it is going to win. The difficulty, there's a very firm line with alcohol as to what constitutes a slip. If you put the alcohol in your body, you have slipped. If you haven't, you haven't. And when the obsession starts to grip the alcoholic, it is possible you can sometimes do something about it. If you can get to a meeting, how many people have been to a meeting convinced they're going to drink, but something clicks in the meeting? It's very, very powerful. The difficulty with the S stuff is it's so much more internal. You can be so far gone mentally, just in a matter of seconds, that it's too late. It's like, it really is like falling through ice. With alcohol, mercifully, one often has to go somewhere to buy the alcohol, which gives one some breathing space. So in AA, we say that one avoids wet places in the first year, or certainly until one has achieved some sort of stability in relation to one's alcoholism. The difficulty with the S stuff is that the wet place, as it were, the place where alcohol is one's own mind. And it's as though the drink is poured into it simply by happening to think of a person, happening to think of a place which is associated with sex. So it's my experience with alcohol, it was very, very black and white. It just had to stop. The alcohol had to stop first. With the S stuff, there are people that have come to SA or SAA or SLA and just, as it were, put the plug in the jug and stopped the behavior fully straight away. Wasn't the case with me, and it's been the case with very few people I've known, most people, it takes a while to get the hang of what to do when the insanity starts to strike. And it takes a while to build up the new habits, to clear away the past, to clear away those blocks to the higher power in the first 9 steps, using the first 9 steps, such that God becomes permanently available, so that in those moments when the feeling grips you, you have something else to hold on to. You are no longer obliged. You are no longer the slave of that impulse. There is something else, the flimsy reed, which becomes the hand of God. So the people I've sponsored who are alcoholics or Al-Anons, but also SAs or SARS or whatever, the experience almost invariably is to plow on and complete the first 9 steps as quickly and briskly and solidly as possible. And in the meantime, to, as far as possible, contain the acting out to, I don't want to get explicit, but to safe environments, those which don't involve other people, don't involve danger, don't involve particular danger of arrest, and so on, to find an outlet which works. Other people have to go completely cold turkey, that anything in that area is going to trigger them completely. So unfortunately, it's a very nasty withdrawal period, but there we go, that's the price. So people do legitimately have different experiences there. With some people, it all has to stop all at once. Other people, it trails off over time, which is why maybe there are, you've got SA, you've got SAA, you've got SCA, and you've got SLA, and I'm sure there are other fellowships as well. Different things appear to work for different people because it's a slightly different matter than alcohol. I hope that answers your question, Jason. Very good. Any other questions? Okay, Jason, should we wrap it up?
Yep. Some people are sometimes a little bit shy. Are you sure anyone doesn't have a question for Tim? There you go. Boris has got a question for you, Tim.
Yeah, here's Boris, SA Germany. So I spoke or speak with a SA sister often, and she asked me why isn't AA a relapse the first drink alcohol, any amount, and why mainly in SA it's not seen as a relapse if I give into lustful thoughts or looks, for example, and I don't know what's the answer. I hope I could explain it.
Okay, thank you. I didn't fully follow the question, but the gist that I got is definitions of what is a relapse and what is not a relapse. Even in AA, you've got questions about, if someone has a painkiller with codeine in it, does that mean they've relapsed? There are all sorts of questions. I don't get involved in those questions of defining a relapse. Just tell the truth. If you've drunk alcohol, you say you've drunk alcohol. If you've performed a particular act, you've performed a particular act. I'm not interested in legal classifications of what is a relapse and what is not a relapse. I don't think it helps, particularly with the sex and love stuff. My experience was that there was a gradual progression towards sanity and health, and being legalistic about as it were, the legal status of what I've done is neither here nor there. When my behavior was sputtering back and forth between healthy and unhealthy, what I did do with my friends in recovery is simply tell the truth. If you do something you shouldn't have done, tell someone so that it's not a secret, and then proceed on that basis. Pavel.
Hello, thanks, Tim. Pavel, sexaholic. So I want to ask, like with the anonism, because I feel also this part of the disease, where is the line? Because there's in big book written that like helping another is really like a great way how to stay sober. But where is the line where it becomes anonism and where it's helpful to my recovery? Thanks.
It's a very good question. Okay, so in one sense, I've never helped anyone in the world of recovery. What I've done is made myself available for the higher power to help other people through me. No one has ever helped me in recovery. People made themselves available and the higher power helped me through them. Where anonism really kicks in, there are many things which look like helping, which don't help. I remember once I realized a friend of mine, I had a long conversation with him, and I thought to myself, I've just spent an hour talking to this person. How long is he sober? 3 days. How long have I been talking to him? 15 years. Why am I still talking? Now, I could continue to be a friend to him. There's no point in me trying to help because the help wasn't helping. So whether something helps, you determine that by whether or not it's helping, not whether it looks like help. So there's a complete difference between service in AA is personally indifferent. In other words, I sponsor a bunch of people, but when I'm not sponsoring them, when I'm going for a walk or playing the piano or at work, I don't consider myself to be sponsoring anyone. If I'm talking to a person, then I'm sponsoring them. If I'm not talking to them, I'm not sponsoring them. It's not like a permanent state of attachment. The anonism is about this constant mental preoccupation where you have this permanent psychic link to the sick person, where every twitch in their mind or life, it's like it's connected with a string and it pulls you at your end. And so the reason one then tries to control them is if you can make them sit still and stop twitching, you'll stop twitching in sympathy. So it's the thing as well, the difference between helping, real helping in AA and Al-Anon control, manipulation, martyrdom, mothering. Again, one doesn't need to get legalistic about it. You know the difference. You know when you're doing it impersonally and cheerfully and lightly, and you know when you're psychically linked. So if you're honest with yourself, you know the difference. Sometimes people who have an Al-Anon background need to relearn how to be helpful in a dispassionate, disinterested way, without the psychic link, to be simply like in a school canteen where the dinner lady is putting the food on the plate of the person, then they move along. You put the food on the plate of the next person, they move along. The dinner lady does not have a personal relationship with each child that comes past. She's just putting the food on the plate, then she goes on to the next plate. The Al-Anon takes the plate to the table and is trying to feed the person with their dinner. It's a fundamentally different type of relationship. And with a bit of attention, if you pay attention, you'll start to see the difference very, very clearly. Good. Any more questions? I think we're done, Jason. Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, thanks. I think we are, Tim. The one question that gets asked a lot is your contact details. Will you be placing them in the chat?
Yeah, so if you look at the, I'll actually put the link directly, just a second.
On your screen there, is that your contact there, is it?
It is there, but what I'm going to do, I put that in the chat as well, so it's clickable on, so people
Okay,
are
cool.
able to contact me on there. So,
Okay.
so next time, which is I think is 4 weeks hence, we'll be on step 2. So Jason, shall I close with a serenity prayer?
Yeah, yep, you can do that.
Very good. So would you please unmute if you care to and join me in the serenity prayer?